Welcome to the Living Out podcast, helping people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Living Out podcast. And I hope you recognise my voice, Ed Shaw, one of the team at Living Out, the ministry director. And this is episode 7 of our series for church leaders. It's for you if you're a church leader in basically any shape or form. You might be ordained, you might not be ordained, you might be an elder, a small group leader, a deacon, a minister, a pastor, a vicar, a rector, a bishop, or even an archbishop. Who knows? All are welcome here, and it's very good to have you with us. If you're not a church leader and you're thinking, I'm enjoying this anyway, why not pass on this series to your church leader so they can enjoy it too? At Living Out, at the sort of homepage of our website, it says, we help people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality. And this episode's focus is on how those in church leadership can help their sisters and brothers in their church families engage with the society that God has placed us in. And that's quite a challenge. I'm looking forward to taking up that challenge with my guests today, who are two people involved in church leadership themselves. Adam, the Anglican, is what I'm going to call him today, and Andrew, the nonconformist, which, you know, as I wrote it down as a potential way of sort of naming Andrew Bunn, I thought that just works on so many levels.
Perfect.
Good morning. Before we go into the sort of main diet this morning, I'd love to hear from both of you. What's your favourite way of engaging with our culture today? What's your preferred medium? Andrew Bunn, you've acknowledged your presence already. Tell us what it is.
Well, I'm going to go for two, I think, slightly outside the box answers. One is the TV show I think every preacher particularly, but also pastor in general, should watch, which is Gogglebox, which is the show where you're watching people watch TV. Because if you watch that 1 hour a week, you get a summary highlights of the big things people are watching, a little flavour of what are the big things people are watching talking about, a non-scientific cross-section of society's responses to it. And I think that's great because you're getting both the culture and also how people are engaging with it. And my other one would be a podcast by a group called Axis, who I've grown to really like over in the States. And they're all about helping parents connect with the kind of culture of young people. And they have this weekly podcast called The Culture Translator, where they take 3 big cultural things, particularly relevant for kind of Gen Z under 25s, and they explain them to you and they discuss them from a Christian perspective. And I find those two things together help me feel I vaguely know what's going on in the world and can be a bit equipped to connect with people.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andrew. Adam, what about you?
I think if I want to do it intentionally, I think I'm unintentionally engaging with culture and society every day, every moment, every day. But I want to do it intentionally, then I love watching a film and having a discussion with friends or colleagues about it. And particularly just trying to drum deep into the worldview of that film. What do they think goodness is? What do they think evil is? How do they think the world works? What do they say unintentionally or intentionally about the divine? And what is pleasing and good about this worldview which they're presenting, which sort of chimes with the Christian worldview, but at the same time, what is problematic and needs to be questioned and addressed?
And can I just say that is just a wonderful example of the value you get from the Living Out podcast. Not only did you get an introduction into what Adam Curtis does on an evening off, but you got a way of analysing almost any film that you watch ever from this point on. Brilliant. Fantastic stuff.
And this podcast is free. It's amazing.
And this podcast is free. For me, what I love doing actually is walking down the Gloucester Road in Bristol, which is near where I live, and there's a bookshop called Gloucester Road Books, which is a bookshop that is stocking books for this area, which is an amazing hodgepodge of different views. And what I love is just going to the central table and seeing what the bookshop are promoting, and they are always promoting something that is which is promoting the latest views on sexuality, identity, gender, often a novel, sometimes a non-fiction book, and just picking that up and buying it. Let's be honest, and reading it has been a really helpful thing for me to do, just to see what people in my area are thinking and reading. As is just paying attention to what everybody's watching on Netflix, and I think I can't remember if I've done a blog post here, but watching Netflix's sex education series was an eye-opener for me in working out where teenagers today are getting their sex education from and what they're hearing and what they're believing in response. There we are. That is how culturally engaged we are. Okay, previously on this series, we've talked about the importance of teaching the Bible's view on sexuality, and we're massively committed to that here at Living Out. But how do we teach church family members to live well in our Western post-Christian society and to interact with it well? We're going to get practical in a moment, but what would be the biblical mindsets we need to encourage, biblical examples we might point ourselves and our church families to as we seek to engage with society? Who wants to go first?
I think one of the concepts I found most helpful is how the New Testament talks to us about the fact that we are exiles and foreigners, strangers and aliens in this place and this age. And so 1 Peter particularly would be the letter that kind of talks about that actually we are now citizens of heaven, as Paul says in Philippians 3, that actually we are exiles living in a strange land in that sense. And that impacts how we live and how we interact with the world around us. And so 1 Peter 2 particularly, where he says, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. And then he tells us how to live in the positive sense. Live your good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. And there's this idea of we are those who don't fit in, actually. We're foreigners and exiles in this place. Actually, what we've got to do about that is we're to resist the sinful temptations we might experience that wage war against our soul, which are very active about doing good in wider society, with hope that actually people see that goodness and ultimately glorify God. And there's debate whether glorifying God is now or on that day of visitation. But the point is we hold fast to biblical truth, we seek to live Jesus' way, we do good in society around us, and ultimately that points people to God. And I find that whole thing, that concept of thinking of myself as a foreigner, an exile, a stranger, an alien in this land really helpful. It makes sense of why so much of how I think and how I live sticks out and seems odd to people around me, because it should do. I'm from a different place in a sense. I've got a different citizenship and residency, and that's going to impact that. And so it helps me both in processing that sense of, I feel like I'm odd one out, oh, that's all right, I should be, but also thinking how I should seek to live in the world.
And that exile language, isn't it, picking up beautifully on Old Testament books like Jeremiah and Daniel. Well, Jeremiah, when God's people were about to go into exile, and Jeremiah's telling them to seek the good of the city that they will be exiled in and to interact with it, but also not to assimilate into it. And Daniel, that just wonderful example of someone who lives a distinctive life as an exile in a foreign country, that doesn't compromise on the big things, but also is willing to interact with the society around him and be part of it and make sure that there is a distinctive witness for God's people in the midst of quite a hostile culture. Adam, what about you?
Yeah, no, I just totally agree with that, and yeah, that really speaks so clearly. I was reading a great book by Stephen McAlpine, Being the Bad Guys, which really spoke into this sort of situation that we are exiles, we are different, and we should expect there to be opposition. And he sort of just clearly sort of spoke about how all the opposition you receive because of the gospel is made clear within the gospel, like how people responded and reacted to Jesus Christ is actually how we should expect that people are going to respond and react to us. And just thinking about that explains so much, doesn't it? That sometimes when you're living to Jesus Christ, people find that so attractive and they're so drawn to it. And sometimes when you're living for Jesus Christ, people are just horrified by it, horrified by beliefs and practices and ideas. But none of that should really surprise us. We can rest in the fact that this is totally normal. The fact that we live in a culture which is opposed to our beliefs is a totally normal thing.
And I think that's one of the best things, isn't it, for us to remember, particularly when we get quite fazed by perhaps growing levels of opposition in Western society, is that Christians and the church have been here before. You know, Jesus both repelled and attracted people when he walked this earth, and Christians and people who've lived for God, like Daniel and Jeremiah in the Old Testament, have had the same effect, repelled and attracted at the very same time. And I know I often go around and sorry, this is the moment when we all sort of easily slip into things we say at Living Out days, and the other people roll their eyeballs because they've heard it so much. But I love the challenge that Andrew took us to 1 Peter, which I think is a challenge to baffle people in society today. I think that's what Christians are most called to do. We're meant to live such good lives that are attractive, even as we say things and sometimes do things that people are repelled by. And certainly as a group at Living Out, I hope that the way that we live our lives is attractive and draws people to Jesus. But what we say about sex and marriage does repel people. And people often can't quite believe that we are nice people that say such horrible things. But that is often the moment when they ask the questions. We get the opportunity to have the conversation. We get the opportunity to talk about what Jesus says and why we're willing to follow him and what he says on sex and marriage. And I love the opportunity to baffle people, because it's in baffling people that so often you get the opportunity to point people to Jesus, who baffled people too.
Amen. Our lives need to be a paradox.
And they certainly are. What do we need to get over as we do this? So in society today, what are the things that we just as Christians just need to get over because of the changes that have been, and we perhaps have been not so good at recognising how profound those changes have been and the impact on society's attitudes to Christianity? Any thoughts on that?
We've got to get over the idol of comfort. Like here in the West, in Britain, like our lives are so easy and so comfortable that when we experience any hostility, I assume, oh, this isn't going to be like this, or God no longer loves me, or I must be doing something wrong. And it's like, no, we've got to get over this idol of comfort. Actually, to live and to speak for Jesus, it's going to bring us into places of hostility, but it's in those places of hostility that we can experience incredible blessings, and we can build his kingdom and do great things for him.
I think related to that, it's just the desire to be liked. We've got to let go of our desire for everyone to like us and think we're great. And I think we're just seeing an interesting historical moment of we're coming out of a time when culturally, so in the UK, broadly cultural beliefs have been Christianized, even if not Christian through and through, and people didn't actually have true love and following of Jesus. And so we kind of fitted in with a general morality up until over 60, 70, 80 years ago. And so you could just kind of fit in as a normal person, but more and more actually we're not. I feel like we're coming actually back into the more normal Christian experience of, actually you're often disliked, which is exactly what Jesus talks about, when Peter talks about, you see examples throughout Scripture. And we just need to get to a point where we're actually okay with the fact that sometimes faithfully following Jesus means not being liked in some places, some areas by some people. And that's hard for any human to deal with. We want to be liked, of course we do. But actually remembering we've received, in a sense, the ultimate like from the one who really matters helps us then deal with the fact that actually seeking to faithfully follow him will mean some people don't like us sometimes.
And the historian in me just always wanted to draw people's attention to the fact that, yes, there have been centuries in this country where Christian sexual ethics seem to be the majority view. The fact that that's changed is a fact of history. But we've been there, we've been here before, and becoming the minority has again some advantages that we need to be aware of. That actually Christianity grew most when we were a distinctive minority group, living in a way that was both attractive and also repelled people, and therefore got people thinking at the same time. And if you see how Christianity grew in the first and second centuries, it was because we were a minority. It was because, in particular, our sexual ethics were a standout thing for the world around us, and people were both horrified by that, but then just saw the good fruit of that, and that was one of the trails that God used to bring them to Jesus. I think the other thing I'd throw in, and I'd say this sort of personally, is there's often talk of we're now on the wrong side of history. And what I've just said contradicts that, but also just reading Revelation is the best contradiction of that. We are on the side that wins ultimately. And when we think, we're becoming a minority group in the West, and it's very easy to sort of end up thinking, yep, Christianity's dying out, we're on the losing side. And for fear of that to mean that we walk away from Jesus. And I love reminding myself through the book of Revelation that history ends with people from all tribes and nations gathered around the throne, that we are, if I can put it like this, on the winning side, and also that the church is declining in the parts of the West that we're part of. But go around the world and you'll see people from all tribes and nations becoming Christians, being attracted to Jesus, and just being reminded of that is where history is heading. We're not on the wrong side of history. In fact, we're on the right side of history, and we are called to point people to where history is ultimately heading, which is that wonderful praise party around the throne of Christ.
As a charity, Living Out relies on the generosity of people like you to be able to produce our free resources, helping same-sex attracted Christians and equipping the church. If you like what we do, please consider supporting us financially. You can give a one-off donation or a regular amount at livingout.org/give. Thank you so much.
Okay, we've talked about some of the biblical principles that we need to have in place, some of the sort of the attitudes that we need to encourage in ourselves and others. But let's think about how we equip church family members to have the right attitude to our society. Any thoughts on how we can particularly avoid the sense we've sometimes given in the past that we're the self-righteous people looking down on society, and that any sort of interactions with society is felt as just being judgmental?
I always find the example of Jesus so helpful here. In a sense, the only one who's ever had any right to be self-righteous, and yet neither is. And just that striking fact, if you read the Gospels, and Jesus seems to be drawn to the people whom others assume God would reject or hate. And actually even that they seem to be drawn to him as well. And just kind of reflecting on the example of Jesus, seeking to have our hearts shaped by him, I think is just so helpful. And this is a model for us to seek to emulate and to ask the Spirit to cultivate in us the same kind of heart we see in evidence in the Gospels and Jesus.
I think we need to cultivate a fear of God over a fear of man. Because the reality is, like, if we have a fear of man, and people hold beliefs or attitudes which we disagree with, if we have a fear of man, then we can like demonize them, or either we're going to demonize them or we're going to run away from them. But neither of those things are particularly Christian. Wherever we have a fear of God, then actually, even if people are very different to us and hold different beliefs and worldviews and different attitudes, if we've got a fear of God, then actually it enables us to make people the right size, because everyone is the exact same size as us, because it means God is seen for who he is in his wonder, in his majesty, in his power, and in his splendour.
Yeah, thank you so much. And how can we equip church families to have the best understanding and appreciation of our society? Because I think sometimes, one of the gaps we've got to bridge is actually helping some Christians understand what people, their neighbours, their friends, their colleagues are really thinking, what's really driving them. Any sort of tips on that?
I wonder if there's two sides of the coin here, and some people need to be encouraged to engage with things that help them understand the culture we're living in, which could just be it doesn't come naturally to them, and so they need encouragement to do it. It could be oh no, we mustn't engage with the stuff of the world kind of thing. But actually encouragement, some people need encouragement. No, it's good and healthy to do this in sensible ways and purposeful ways. And then on the flip side, some people need encouragement because they do already engage lots, but they need encouragement to think that through more deeply and think through more critically. And so not just to take in lots of stuff and absorb it and not think about the messages and such like, and even the impact it's having on them. But like Adam gave us the nice example earlier, when he watches a film and then analyses it, thinks it through, talks it through with friends, some people are already engaging in loads of culture, but actually what they need is the help to think, how do I actually learn from this? How am I critical in the sense of analysing this and thinking then how can I use it to engage with people who aren't yet followers of Jesus?
It'd be really helpful, wouldn't it? Perhaps if Adam wrote a blog post for us, just perhaps sharing some of those questions
so
that people listening to this podcast can actually use them next time they watch the film. I mean, let's just put it out there and see, if he responds. Adam, anything else you'd suggest apart from that on how we can help people sort of grow in their understanding, appreciation of where our society is coming from?
Well, now I'm cautious. Cautious if I say anything, you're starting out to do more work. It was just pushing into some of the things Andy was talking about there, just the need to put on Christian spectacles, the need to see the world through a Christian worldview, and to think critically about bus adverts, and to ask questions about the music we're listening to and the films we're watching, and to start being more intentional and delving a bit deeper. Because actually, I think everyone is already surrounded by culture and surrounded by society, and everyone is already engaging with these things. But the question is, are we doing this in a thoughtful way? rather than just in a blind way.
And I think one of the things we've perhaps unintentionally started doing in this series is talk about parenting. But one of the things we really want to be doing probably as church leaders is equipping the parents in our church family to help their kids start to do this. And to look at, I think bus adverts is a good thing, isn't it? What are they saying? Why are they saying that? Advertising, just actually to have gentle conversations in an age-appropriate way with your kids about how somebody is trying to sell something, what they're trying to sell and why they're trying to sell it and how they're trying to sell it, to help our children actually grow up interacting with society in an intelligent way, helping them to work out, what society is trying to do to us, and also how we can best communicate into a society where a certain type of beautiful person is always used to sell things. Why is that? What's behind that advert? How are people trying to appeal to us? And what does that tell us both about ourselves and other people? I just, ridiculous example, I'm going on holiday and had the usual thing of actually, do I have enough clothes to go on holiday? And was just noticing, as I was buying some clothes that I needed on the internet, how much, they're basically selling to you the idea that if you buy this item of clothing, you will look like this person. And I'm more attracted to the items of clothing that are on the better looking people. And it's ridiculous. Do I really think that, buying this pair of boxer shorts is going to give me a torso like that? No, but at some level, I do think that buying the, and just actually beginning to have this conversation with yourself and with other people and with your kids in particular can be really helpful to understand both society around it and ourselves and the connecting points. Because I think sometimes one of the dangers we can fall into is talking about society as if we don't share any of the same desires. We don't fall for any of the same tricks when we do.
Yes.
And actually having open and honest conversations amongst ourselves can both help us understand ourselves and equip us to better reach out to society around us. We talked about adverts, we've talked about early on, we talked about sort of Netflix, Gogglebox, anything else that sort of helped you really grasp what society is on about, where people are coming from, particularly when it comes to attitudes to sexuality, identity, gender? Anything we'd particularly recommend?
A few topics for me. I would just second what you said, Ed, about the sex education series in Netflix. I think that's a particularly helpful insight into ways of thinking among young people, narratives they're hearing, things like that. On sexuality, I would add the series, I think it was a book originally, now it's a series on iPlayer at the moment called Love Victor, which is about a young teenage lad who comes out as gay. And it's one I think parents particularly should watch because it's the example of what not to do as a parent. He comes out to his parents, they respond really badly. They can be really surprised and not quite rejecting him, but respond really badly. But then quite quickly, one of them particularly just swings to the other side of course this is fine, of course Jesus would be okay with this. There's no careful thinking through what might Jesus think. It's just, of course Jesus must accept it. And it's the two extremes of bad parental reactions of not loving, not engaging well, and then actually saying, oh, obviously Jesus is fine, we don't think this through. So I think that's a great one for the example of what not to do. And then on trans, one of the resources I found most helpful is Juno Dawson's book, What the Tea? And it's a deeply frustrating read because it is so internally kind of incoherent and contradictory, and it's actually really distressing to think of the deeply unhealthy messages it's sending to young people. But it, in one very readable paperback form, summarises, I think, the core tenets of the narratives around gender that lots of young people are hearing. So it's quite a good one-stop shop to get a good grounding in cultural narratives being presented to young people, specifically around gender and transgender.
Anything you'd add, Adam?
I don't know if this is good advice or not good advice, really. But on one level, I'd be like, if you've got either teenagers in your church or you've got a kid of your own, and with their permission, like, could you look through their TikTok? Could you look through their Instagram Reels? Because I just remember a few years ago now, just being shocked, genuinely shocked, that on TikTok there was an in-depth video about the Greek and the meaning of the Greek words around homosexuality in the scriptures, and I was just like, this is on TikTok, and suddenly it made so much sense to me why some of our teenagers at church, why they thought what they thought about the sort of biblical position, was because actually they were hearing these poorly argued and not even very well produced little videos, and they were engaging with loads of this stuff online. And suddenly I was like, oh, this isn't. We've actually got to care about the intellectual sort of side of these arguments a bit more. We can't just ignore the more complicated Greek side, because they are actually thinking about this.
And that's just a really good lesson, isn't it? Because I think probably most of us would think there's no way that teenagers are engaging with Greek translations of significant words in the New Testament. But if TikTok is, they are, and we need to do that as well. Oh, thanks so much. Now, in some ways, we talked about looking at our own hearts. We talked about doing a bit of research. Actually, when it comes to talking to church family members and encouraging them to communicate well with society around us, any top tips that you'd be wanting to share with church leaders so that they can pass them on to church members?
A really simple one I would start with is just asking questions, and Jesus is the great master at this. Asking questions, why people think what they think, why they believe what they believe, and just, genuine kind of being genuinely inquisitive and showing genuine curiosity. It helps us to learn and engage better with where people are at. We learn where they're at, but also people listen to us if we listen to them. So it's a double whammy. We're understanding them better so we can connect better, but also they're going to feel valued, heard, and that's going to give them a bigger chance of them being open to listening to what we say, to engaging with us.
And that's just, isn't it, when you perhaps preaching through the Gospels as a church leader, or doing a series of Bible studies in the Gospels, and you just see every time Jesus interacts, particularly with people that are coming from a different place to him, that's what he does, isn't it? He asks the question rather than doing information download. And as church leaders, equipping church family members to, as you say, to ask good questions rather than do information downloads. I think the church has been really good at saying, this is the gospel outline you can share in 60 seconds with your friend when they come anywhere vaguely near a Christian subject, rather than actually what Jesus does is ask a question of people who are coming from different places and work out exactly where they're coming from, and then gently speak the truth into their real question rather than what we presume their question is. Yeah, really helpful. Adam?
Yeah, I was going to say, Randy Newman's questioning evangelism is so good, giving us practical skills and tips to do that. I've definitely spoken about it on this podcast before, but like non-judgmental listening. I think when I was recently with some very good friends who aren't believers, and so many of their ethical standpoints, their moral views are so opposed to the Christian understanding of reality. And I have just learned over the years I just can't be shocked. And if I'm shocked in any way, really, then actually I just close down conversations. And actually I need to enact non-judgmental listening, and in an appropriate way, ask questions, but sometimes not say anything, and sometimes know when to speak.
And then I think the thing I'd sort of add into the mix, as I often do, is Jonathan Haidt's Moral Matrix in his book, The Righteous Mind, which is just a wonderful way of understanding how people in our society today work out what is right and wrong, do ethics. And he points out that often those of us who are Christians, conservative, religious types, as we might be sort of labelled, appeal to certain things, standards of loyalty, authority, sanctity, whereas in Western liberal discourse, what people care about more are a whole different range of things like care, liberty, fairness. And often we end up speaking what sounds like a very different language to our non-Christian friends. When, for instance, we say the Bible says or Jesus says, full stop, that's enough for us to persuade us that something's right or wrong. But for them, they want to know whether what Jesus says promotes people's freedom, whether it's fair, whether it's actually promoting people's best, or whether it's actually causing harm. Okay, what about this context in which we're feeling under pressure from society to support what it says about sexuality in ways that might seem to contradict our faith? So a couple of examples might be a workplace saying everybody needs to wear a rainbow lanyard, or a workplace saying this June we are going to be supporting Pride in a really big way. This is often the time when Christians and society sort of most seem to clash, most seem to interact, and perhaps a lot of the rest of the year Christians can keep our heads down and not really think or share what we think about sexuality, identity and gender. But that's not possible in many contexts. Any advice you have for people listening in, and particularly church pastors equipping their church family members in the workplace when they're under pressure to do those sort of things?
Well, I'd want to say really clearly, I don't think there's one way of dealing with this. And I think that different churches, different individuals, families are going to come to this and deal with it in different sort of ways. So I know some families who have taken their kids out of pride events, which are happening at their school. And I know some families who have let their kids go along to them. And so I think we've got to be careful that we don't create a narrative which means that there's one way in a church of dealing with this. And then if people feel they can't do that, then they just feel too much pressure coming from their church to act in a certain way which they're not comfortable with. At the same time, I think I want to encourage that there's moments where we've got to be courageous and we've got to be bold and we've got to be brave. But we always want to be bold and courageous in a way which is loving and gentle. So if the first time that people hear about our stance on that we're a Christian or our stance on sexuality is the moment we're being very obviously not joining in with everything else which is going on, then it seems like it's very in your face. It doesn't seem like it's a gentle way of introducing people to the fact that we follow Jesus Christ. So I think we've got to be bold, but we've got to do it in a way which is gentle.
And I love what you just said about actually different people having different responses and not being legalistic in what we say people should do in our church family. And again, I think I wrote a blog post a number of years ago about how in my church in Bristol, people responded in very different ways to some of the big institutions in our city introducing rainbow lanyards. And it was actually really encouraging to me as a pastor to see people respond in different, thoughtful, principled ways. Actually, what most discouraged me are the people that just didn't think at all. And that blog post will be linked to in the show notes. Andrew, anything to add?
Two thoughts for me. One is just that this is part of the being foreigners and exiles, strangers and aliens thing. And that's just helpful to remind ourselves in these difficult situations of, gosh, we're facing this difficult situation. Oh, this is actually normal Christian life. It's okay. Nothing's going wrong in a sense. I think it's just slightly reassuring to pause and think that. And then on pride-related stuff particularly, it's just worth noting that one of the complexities of pride is it's kind of marking, celebrating very different things. The origins of pride basically are lesbian, gay and trans people to some extent back in the, whatever it was, 60s something America, saying it's not okay that police are arresting us and beating us for no apparent reason just because of our sexuality or gender expression. And it's about actually, it's not okay to mistreat people because of experience sexuality and gender. And we should have been the first as Christians to say this is not okay, and we should be the first actually to stand up, and we should still be the first to be working for the genuine fair treatment of all people. And so that part of pride we really want to get behind us. Absolutely, that's built ultimately on Christian values. But then also, of course, pride is about celebrating the embracing of sexuality and internal gender as kind of identity, embracing a load of practices we don't think are right or for people's flourishing. So it's more complex. I mean, we don't want to celebrate those, participate in that way. And so just helpful to be aware there are complexities in pride because it is doing various different things, some of which we say a big yes to, some of which we say actually no, we can't engage with those because of our Christian convictions. And maybe that's also helpful just in understanding different Christians, different choices on these things. Someone might wear the rainbow lanyard because they think, yeah, I want to stand up against genuine homophobia and mistreatment of people. Another person might think, no, I can't because I feel like this is embracing a view of humanity and of what's good for us that isn't true. So it's complex. So it doesn't give us answers, but maybe it does help us in more understanding of each other in the complexity of those decisions.
And this is when I just really want to urge all church leaders listening in to do a sermon series on Daniel if you haven't done one before, because the complexity that Andrew's just talked about is there in the early chapters of Daniel, because Daniel and his friends are having to make quite complex decisions as to what they go along with and what they oppose, when they take their stand, when they don't take their stand. And there is a complexity there, and there are some compromises there in the decisions that Daniel and his friends make. But there are points in which they very clearly say, no more compromise. You can't ask us to do this. And I think I found every time I've gone to Daniel, I've just been blown away by how contemporary it is, particularly for church family members in the workplace, because Daniel and his friends were in a secular workplace and they were having to make sometimes quite big decisions that really affected their future, which is where a lot of our church family members are today. when we get pushback, when church family members get pushback, what do we need to encourage? What words do we use to encourage people? Perhaps particularly when, I don't know, we've shared some of this with our church family, and people have got real pushback, and they're coming to us and said, I did what you told me to. I did it sensitively. I wasn't judgmental. I used the Hype Moral Matrix. I watched all of Sex Education, and yet I still had a lot of grief. How would we as church leaders comfort people who are on the receiving end of quite severe pushback in any of these areas?
I think I'd want to say two things. The first thing I'd want to say is that don't be surprised by this. Nothing what we've said today is the silver bullet. Nothing what we've said today is the way which is going to stop opposition or persecution. Like all the opposition we experience because of the gospel is seen within the gospel. So we shouldn't be surprised by that. But secondly, I'd also want to say, from my own experience, just take a long view. Because actually in the heat of the moment, when we've had difficult conversations with people about faith and sexuality, like people can respond quite negatively. And yet often over time, when they've seen us acting with love and generosity, when they've seen us being patient and kind, when they've seen that we're still committed to the friendship, committed to the working relationship, committed to them, actually over time, I have experienced that those relationships have actually healed, even though they've had very tense conversations with them.
I would want to encourage a church leader having that common conversation to take someone to Jesus. And that's what I would do in that circumstance of, you've had this experience, you've done all the right things in a sense, you tried really hard to engage well, it's not gone well. Jesus gets you, Jesus understands. And it's striking out what 1 Peter does. 1 Peter 3 goes on to talk about the suffering we might experience because we're the odd ones out in society, because people think we're the weirdos, all that kind of stuff. Kind of low-level persecution is what kind of 1 Peter is talking about. And then he goes on to talk about, when you suffer for doing good, remember Jesus suffered for you. And actually I think if Jesus gets it, he's been there. Well, Jesus says, they hated me, they'll hate you. And I think that there is great comfort and great reassurance actually in that. And then not in a trite way, but in a true and good way, I'd want to just be pointing people to their true identity. That actually in the midst of maybe being rejected by friends or colleagues or family members, they are not rejected by God. And that actually the one who truly matters, loves them for them, is rejoicing over them, helping people think about worth and value, so actually we can weather the, in a sense, real rejection we might experience from other people, knowing that ultimately we're not rejected because God loves us, is for us, is with us.
Guys, thank you so much. About halfway through that podcast, I was thinking, have we got enough to say? I think we're probably now well over time, so we need to stop. If that's brought up questions, as I'm sure it has, do remember that you've got actually a chance at the end of this series to ask your questions. So we got a question and answer webinar for church leaders at the end of this series on the 13th of June. Do sign up via the Living Out website. If you've enjoyed this episode, also please just share it with your church leader, with friends, with other people that you know, with your staff team. You can share in a whole number of ways. Perhaps WhatsApp, often the best way of sort of privately sharing what you've heard here. We'll be back soon with our final episode in this series, all about the sort of the legal side of things. What are the freedoms we have, both in and outside of the church context, to articulate what Christians have always believed when it comes to issues around sex, relationships, marriage, gender, and identity. That'll be a great episode. Do join us then. But for now, goodbye.